Good morrow, one and all. I'm Mr. King, and in today's video, we'll be exploring Imtiaz Dharker's poem, Honour Killing. So the plan today is I will quickly introduce the poem to you. We'll then explore some of the key symbolism which runs through the poem, and we'll end by looking at some of the key language and structural techniques which you might want to comment on if you're writing about this poem in your exam. But to start off with, this poem was written by modern poet Imtiaz Dharker, who was born in Pakistan, raised in Glasgow, and now lives between London and Mumbai. And as someone who has experienced many different cultures and influences on who she is as a person, Dharker's poetry often explores the different forces in society that can shape who we are as people. How can culture or religion or gender expectations shape who we are as people? These are all ideas that you can expect to find in this poem. Honour Killing specifically was inspired by an event in Lahore in Pakistan in the 1990s, when a woman was murdered by her own family because she'd asked for a divorce. And when this murder came to public attention, the Senate of Pakistan refused to condemn the killing, and they called it an honour killing, which is a term they used to justify the event. Now, an honour killing is usually when either a woman or a young girl is murdered by her other family members, and the killers justify their actions by claiming that the victim had brought dishonour upon the family. Honour killings are a horrific example of how certain cultural expectations can victimize others. And exploring how cultural expectations can victimize others, that's one of the key themes in this poem. Now, you're probably aware that this poem appears in the conflict cluster of the poetry anthology, so you might be wondering what types of conflict you can expect to see in the poem. The main conflict you can expect is internal conflict or cultural conflict, and in particular, look out for the following: how culture can shape who we are as people, how religion can shape who we are, how gender expectations can shape who we are, and even just how our physical appearance can affect how other people treat us, and how that too can shape who we are as people. So what we'll do now is we'll have a quick look through the poem, check we understand what's going on, and explore some of the key symbolism in the poem. So here we go. At last, I'm taking off this coat, this black coat of a country that I swore for years was mine, that I wore more out of habit than design. Born wearing it, I believed I had no choice. I'm taking off this veil, this black veil of a faith that has made me faithless to myself, that tied my mouth, gave my God a devil's face, and muffled my own voice. I'm taking off these silks, these lacy things that feed dictator dreams, the Mangal Sutra, and the rings rattling in a tin cup of needs that beggared me. I'm taking off this skin, and then the face, the flesh, the womb. Let's see what I am in here when I squeeze past the easy cage of bone. Let's see what I am out here, making, crafting, plotting at my new geography. Now I wonder what your first impressions of this poem were. I hope you noticed how in the first 4 stanzas that the narrator is taking things off: a coat, a veil, these silks and lacy things, even her own skin, face, flesh, and womb. And each of these different things, the coat, the veil, the silks, the skin, they all represent different forces or expectations that are placed upon people and shape and control who they are. So by taking them off, the narrator is saying that she doesn't want to be defined or controlled or shaped by these forces anymore. She's taking them off. She's rejecting them. And once she's taken them all off, she's free to explore who she is and to work out for herself who she wants to be. That's why the final two stanzas are very different in tone. They're much more hopeful. Let's see what I am in here when I squeeze past the easy cage of bone. Let's see what I am out here, making, crafting, plotting at my new geography. Once she's free of all of these cultural and societal expectations, she's free to create her own identity, ending in this very hopeful, optimistic way. But what are these various expectations that she is rejecting? Let's have a quick look at them. So in stanza 1, she says that she's rejecting this coat, taking off this coat of a country that she swore for years was hers. This coat seems to be symbolic of cultural expectations, the expectations that someone has to follow when they live in a certain culture, certain practices, certain habits. She believed she had no choice but to follow these expectations, but the narrator at last has decided to take off this coat, this black coat of a country. She's not going to be defined or shaped by her cultural expectations anymore. In the second stanza, the narrator is taking off a veil, a black veil of a faith. So here she's taking off something which represents faith or religion. So by taking this off, she's saying that she doesn't want to be defined by religious expectations. Religious expectations which made her faithless, which tied her mouth, which gave her God a devil's face and muffled her own voice. The narrator of this poem seems to be indicating that the religious expectations that she had to live under were oppressive, were constricting. They even subverted her religion, making her God seem evil or devilish, and that's why she's rejecting it. Having rejected cultural expectations in stanza 1 and religious expectations in stanza 2, in stanza 3, the narrator is taking off silks and lacy things, which seems to be a reference to underwear or lingerie, because they feed dictator dreams. She's also taking off Mangal Sutra and rings. Mangal Sutra is a necklace worn by some Hindu women in wedding ceremonies. And so the silks and lacy things, which could represent underwear, and Mangal Sutra and rings, which are symbols of weddings, altogether, these items seem to be symbolic of expectations placed upon women based upon their gender. So stanza 3 is a rejection of gendered expectations. She says that the silks and lacy things that she felt compelled to wear had the effect of feeding dictator dreams. A dictator is someone who has absolute control, so there's a suggestion that she was maybe forced to wear certain types of underwear, perhaps to be sexualized, and she's rejecting this. She's also taking off symbols of weddings or marriage, saying she doesn't want to be defined by marriage either, because altogether these various expectations beggared her, made her feel poor and empty inside. In the final stanza, the narrator is taking off her own skin. She doesn't want to be defined by the way she physically looks. She doesn't want her physical appearance to affect her identity, how she's perceived by others, or how she perceives herself. She's even taking off her own face, her own flesh. She's moving right past what's on the outside to what's on the inside. She's even taking off her own womb. The womb is a symbol of motherhood, and she's getting rid of that too, which seems to suggest that she doesn't want to be defined by the expectations of being a mother. And I hope you noticed that as we've moved through these 4 stanzas, we've moved from things which are very external, like a coat or a veil, to much more intimate things, such as underwear, even skin, face, flesh, the womb. We've sort of had a zooming in effect, starting from the external in stanza 1 to the very internal, ending with the womb in stanza 4. And you could comment on this structural choice to zoom in, to become more and more intimate, I don't know about you, but for me, I think it's quite uncomfortable to imagine someone taking off their own skin, face, flesh, and womb. This very invasive language seems to suggest that the cultural expectations that she is rejecting in stanzas 1, 2, 3, and 4 are very invasive. They affect every part of her from the outside to the inside, and that's why it's so important that she takes them all off. But once she has taken them all off, she's free to explore who she wants to be. And we have this really hopeful tone. Let's see what I am in here when all of these things have been gotten rid of. Let's see what I am out here making, crafting, plotting at my new geography. So with those key ideas established, let's begin to think about how we could analyse the language and structural decisions made in this poem. But we've already done a lot of that, and let's just be really explicit about what we have already done. Firstly, we've explored various types of symbolism in this poem, and that is a language technique you can write about. You could write about the symbolism of the black coat of a country representing her cultural expectations, or how the black veil of a faith is symbolic of religious expectations, etc. If you prefer, you could also use the language of metaphors. The black veil of a faith is a metaphor for her religious expectations. This is a language feature you can and indeed should write about in this poem. We also talked about this structural point, that there's a zooming in from external symbols of expectations to internal expectations from stanza 1 to stanza 4. And this suggests two things. That first of all, these various expectations have the ability to affect every single part of a person. And two, this zooming in is quite uncomfortable to witness, which in turn could suggest how uncomfortable it is when these expectations affect different parts of people's lives. The final thing to talk about, which is another structural comment, is how there's a real contrast in tone. In stanzas 1, 2, 3, and 4, there's a sense of rejection. I'm taking off, I'm taking off. Whereas in stanzas 5 and 6, there's a more hopeful tone. Let's see, let's see. It's much more optimistic. And that contrast in tone draws attention to how much better it is when we are free to explore who we want to be for ourselves, free from various expectations. And it also shows how oppressive in contrast it can be when we have these expectations in the first place in stanzas 1, 2, 3, and 4. So in this final part of the video, we'll look at a few other language or structural techniques which we haven't considered yet, but might be really useful for you to write about if this comes up in the exam. One really useful technique to think about is Dharker's use of anaphora, which is when a phrase is repeated at the start of a line or the start of a stanza. And anaphora is used when Dharker repeats "I'm taking off." Here, the anaphora has the effect of making the narrator sound really determined to be free of the various cultural expectations imposed upon her. We also have anaphora used again in stanzas 5 and 6, and here I would argue that the anaphora has the effect of creating a more hopeful or optimistic tone, which mirrors how hopeful and optimistic she feels now that she's able to explore her own identity and work out who she is for herself, free from the various expectations we've already talked about at length. The poem begins with the words "at last," which creates a really relieved tone, signalling how relieved the narrator is to finally be free of all of these expectations that have been oppressing her for so long. And we can see just how challenging she's found these expectations by looking at the language used to describe them. When writing about the cultural expectations she is taking off, she compares them to a black coat of a country. Now, unfortunately, the adjective black in literature, historically, has been given connotations of something which is oppressive or sinister or challenging. So by using the adjective black in this way to describe the black coat of a country, perhaps Dharker is suggesting that the cultural expectations are very oppressive, very sinister, they were very challenging. And that idea is repeated in the second stanza when the veil of a faith, which we remember is a symbol of religious expectations, is also described as a black veil of a faith. So in the same way, by using the adjective black to describe the veil, perhaps Dharker is suggesting that the religious expectations she is getting rid of were also oppressive, sinister, or challenging. There's a real sense of frustration, even possibly an aggressive tone directed at the cultural expectations she is getting rid of. She swore for years these expectations were hers. The verb swore has very aggressive connotations, and that is mirrored by the aggressive consonant sound or alliteration of the letter C. This coat, this black coat of a country, it creates a very aggressive sound which highlights how frustrated the narrator was having to live under these appalling cultural expectations she did not like and wanted to reject. She ends the stanza by saying she believed she had no choice. It's a very matter-of-fact tone, but the irony is this whole poem shows that actually she does have a choice because she's choosing to get rid of them after all. When writing about the religious expectations she's freeing herself from, Dharker uses a number of oxymorons, which is self-contradictory language. So, for example, she writes about a faith that made her faithless. So this is an internal contradiction, and I would suggest that the oxymoron here suggests that the religious expectations were so oppressive that it turned something good, faith, into something less good, faithless. The expectations took something good and made them worse, and that's sort of symbolized in the oxymoron. A very similar thing happens later on in the same stanza. Her God was given a devil's face. Usually we associate God with something which is positive, heavenly, the devil with something more sinister and evil. And the fact that the religious expectations were so oppressive, they were so awful, it made God seem devilish or satanic, showing how appalling these expectations were. If we go back to the first oxymoron, a faith that made me faithless, there's a really interesting use of enjambment. Enjambment is when a line or a sentence continues over a line break, which we have here because the words to myself really stand out. And it's interesting, if you just read the words a faith that made me faithless, you might assume that she's writing about she's faithless in God. But it's really interesting that the enjambment draws our attention to the fact that what she becomes faithless to is not her God, she becomes faithless to herself. What she's saying in a very roundabout way here is the religious expectations imposed upon her destroyed so much of her life that it meant she didn't even trust herself, she didn't have faith in herself anymore. And that's a really invasive and awful consequence of these religious expectations, which is why it was so important for the narrator to let them go. There's a lot of very violent imagery in this stanza associated with the religious expectations. They tied her mouth, they muffled her own voice, and these similar ideas are repeated to reinforce just how restrictive the expectations were. When we come to the language used to describe the expectations of women and gendered expectations, there's some imagery that's really worth reflecting on. There's language of taking off silks and lacy things, which seems to allude to underwear or lingerie, which is something a person might wear to feel more attractive or to present themselves in a certain way. Now, there's a suggestion here that the narrator felt compelled to wear these silks, these lacy things, to conform to the dreams of other people, to conform to the dreams of people who are like dictators, who want women to dress in a certain way, to conform to their own definition of what is attractive. So by rejecting or by taking off these silks and lacy things, she's saying she refuses to conform to another person's definition of what is attractive, and she's not going to be controlled by these dictators and their dreams. We then come to this piece of imagery where the narrator rejects symbols of marriage. So she takes off the Mangal Sutra, which is a necklace worn by some brides in some Hindu wedding ceremonies, and she takes off rings, which are different symbols of marriage. And some people can feel a lot of expectations placed upon them to marry well. And what the narrator seems to be suggesting here is that marriage did not meet her needs. In fact, the expectations of marriage made her feel poor. They made her feel even needier. And we've got this really interesting piece of imagery where she talks about the Mangal Sutra and rings rattling around in a tin cup of needs. The tin cup of needs makes me imagine someone on the street, perhaps begging for money, perhaps holding out a tin cup asking for money. But instead of money in the tin cup, we're asked to imagine the Mangal Sutra and the rings rattling around, suggesting that the narrator is needy, she's desperate, she needs things, and marriage is not something that's going to meet her fundamental needs, which is why she's rejecting it. And this idea of her needs not being met is reinforced by the verb beggared, which itself is a reference to a beggar, someone who is desperate, who is in need of help. The expectation of women to marry in a certain way is something that the narrator clearly rejects here, because for her, it didn't meet her needs, and she wants to find her own identity in a way which meets her own needs. In the fourth stanza, when the narrator is taking off the final symbols of oppression, the skin, the face, the flesh, the womb, these final things are listed. It creates a very fast-paced tone, almost like she's just desperate to get rid of these final things as quick as she can. Now she's started to free herself from various expectations. She wants to get rid of the final ones as fast as she can. So a sense of urgency is created through the listing, and also a sense of relief at the end once the final things have been gotten rid of. When we move into the fifth stanza, the narrator is finally free of all these expectations and is now exploring her own identity for herself. And there's imagery of freedom and possibility in this stanza. She's squeezing past a cage of bone. The cage of bone seems to allude to her rib cage, her skeleton. She's freeing herself from all physical constraints. She's getting out of anything which traps her, which is suggested by the image of a cage. And there's a suggestion of freedom now. She can be who she wants to be. And that's reinforced by the list we have in the final stanza. She's making, she's crafting, she's plotting. These verbs are all creative and they're all expressive verbs, which symbolize her freedom to do what she wants, be who she wants to be, now that she's free of all of these expectations. And by ending with this imagery of plotting her new geography, it almost sounds like she's making a map of herself. She's plotting for herself or deciding for herself exactly who she wants to be, where the boundaries of herself lie, and allowing herself to be the person that she wants to be. Ending with this really hopeful and inspiring note. So that brings us to the end of this poem. I hope you found this analysis really useful. If you have any questions, do feel free to pop them in the comments below, and I will see you in the next video. So good luck writing about this poem, and I will see you later. Cheerio.